Anyway, welcome to our last CT of the semester. I'll be teaching today on the Christian hope, which is a look at Revelation 21 through 22, which, as we'll see, is going to mean a look at the whole rest of the book of Revelation as well. So prepare to put on your seatbelts because we're going to talk about some cool stuff today. So why don't we go ahead and pray, and then we will get started.
Again, because I did it already, but I pray you would help him deliver his learning well. Effectively, the serious and eerie and kind of like topic.
God, thank you for the hope that you do give, your honor and in eternity. And I just pray that we wouldn't take that for granted, and that you would help us to communicate this hope to other people who don't have it.
Yeah, God, I'm really grateful just for your word, for the ways that you revealed yourself to us, the way that you reveal your intentions for humanity, because that's kind of the key idea that we're going to be looking at today. So I'm grateful that you have provided this library of texts that we call the Bible, that's profoundly critical of human evil, but also profoundly hopeful in ways that I don't think are really duplicated anywhere else. So God, I'm really grateful for the picture of hope that you give us in the final pages of the Bible. And I ask that you would speak to our hearts so that what we're hearing today would be meaningful for us, not just as a Bible lesson, but as something to carry forward with us as we move into the future. We pray these things in your son's name. Amen. Okay. So what I'm hoping to explore today, as we get started with this teaching on the Christian hope, is one of the more important questions that I think Christians need to grapple with, but a question that I think, at least as I think back to my childhood growing up, and then just conversations that I still have with folks, it's a question I don't think we have as much clarity on really as we need. So I think it's really important for us to consider the big question of today, which is what sort of hope does the Christian tradition, broadly speaking, offer? What sort of hope can we draw from our scriptures that applies not just to us, but that emerges from the Christian teachings more broadly, because it's drawn from the New Testament. So while it might seem unlikely for those whose high school reading included Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, did anybody read this sermon? Okay, you should go home and read it. It's a very interesting read. It's by Jonathan Edwards. And I read it and I was like, geez, God does not like people very much at all, does he? And that was kind of my takeaway from that sermon. And so if that's kind of our idea, that God does not like humans very much, it might be a bit of a shock, what I'm claiming, which is that I think that the biblical authors are profoundly critical of human evil, but they're also profoundly hopeful about God's purpose to rescue and redeem the good world that he's made. And that includes us, that includes humans. So that's really cool. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about the picture of hope that we see in the last pages of the Bible at the end of the New Testament book that we call the Revelation. So to understand what the author is saying, we're going to consider this strange but fascinating book as a text that comes out of a particular context. So it's going to be important to understand the text as it would have likely been understood in the time that it was written. So then we're going to look at the final chapters of the book in order to understand what the author's vision of the future has to say about God's ultimate intentions for us, his ultimate intentions for humanity and for the world that he's made. So in all this, if we take nothing else away, my hope is that we can have a clearer vision of what the author of this book believed about the future of God's world, and what their understanding of the Christian hope might mean for us today. So in his book, Surprised by Hope, Rethinking Heaven, the Resurrection, and the Mission of the Church, N.T. Wright describes a children's book on heaven that a friend sent to him. And the reason I'm pulling this long quote out, which is the text of this children's book, is because I think it captures what many people think about when they think about the Christian hope. And N.T. Wright also believes that this captures a lot of people's perspective. And so in the words of this children's book, you might hear a version of the Christian hope that many of us might be familiar with. So in this story, in this children's book, heaven is somewhere you believe in. It's a beautiful place where you can sit on soft clouds and you can talk to all the other people who are there. At night, you can sit next to the stars, which are the brightest of anywhere in the universe. When your life is finished here on earth, God sends angels to take you up to heaven to be with him. And grandma, and this is like, it's a book, which has a story. And so it's about the girl's grandmother. And grandma is alive in me, says the girl. Most important, she taught me to believe in myself. She's in a safe place with the stars, with God and the angels. She's watching over us from up there. I want you to know, says the heroine to her great grandma, that even though you are no longer here, your spirit will always be alive in me. So as Wright sees it, this book and this text from the book describes more or less what millions of people in the Western world have come to believe, to accept as truth, and to teach to their children about the hope that Christians have for our individual and our collective future. The Christian hope is to escape our bodies, to go to some disembodied heaven where things are nice and things are fine all the time. You can sit on soft clouds and you can have nice conversations with people. But the problem for Wright is that this view is preposterous for reasons that are going to come clear in a minute as we get into the biblical text. And so he wrote Surprised by Hope in response to this kind of thinking about the Christian hope being about escaping from this world and going somewhere else. And so this version of the Christian hope, which is the end goal, in which the end goal for humans is this disembodied existence in a nice place called heaven, it's similar to what I ran into in my experiences growing up as a church kid. And so fellow church kids may have had similar experiences. We used to sing this song about heaven. It's called My Father's House. Does anybody know this song? Oh yeah, so people responded. So the lyrics are come and go with me to my father's house. It's a big, big house with lots and lots of room. It's a big, big table with lots and lots of food. A big, big yard where we can play football, and then everyone would scream touchdown. And at which point I had two thoughts. So this is a song like we would sing as kids, like with the other kids. So heaven, apparently, according to this song, heaven's just life in the suburbs on a good day. And if you know me, you'll know that this eternity playing football does not sound much like heaven in my book. And in fact, to me, life in the suburbs for all eternity sounded pretty boring. Like God just be hanging out in the suburbs forever and ever. Amen. And that's the Christian hope. Like at least that's like according to this song. So I think what's really cool then is that there are resources in the tradition of Christianity that kind of deepen our perspective on this question of what is our ultimate hope. So as I read it, the book of Revelation paints a very different picture of the Christian hope. And I think what's really great is that this book can be a tremendous resource for those of us who want to know what early Christians believed was true about themselves, what they believed was true about the world around them, and the direction they believed that the arc of history was bending. But the problem, as many of us are aware, is that like people who have tried to read this book, the problem is that it's one of the less approachable books in the New Testament. It's full of unexplained images and symbols. There's crazy stuff like the stars are falling from the sky. There's a prostitute riding a giant dragon. She has like a cup of wine and she's drunk. And it's like she's drunk driving a dragon through the sky. There's meaning to all of it, but that's the book of Revelation. And it talks about divine judgment and talks about all sorts of like end of the world stuff that makes it seem confusing or unsettling or just plain odd. So we might ask like, why read this book, which has a prostitute drunk driving a dragon across the sky? So for me, I have some history interacting with the book of Revelation from my childhood onward, and this book has been both fascinating and terrifying. So when I was in 4th grade, I was introduced to the Left Behind series. Do we know about this? Yes. Yeah. So many of us who know My Father's House know about the Left Behind series. Is evangelical culture is nothing if not consistent. So the series starts with an event in which Jesus, this is the Christian hope, at least according to Left Behind. Jesus snatches his followers off the face of the earth. They literally, like if you've read the book or you've seen the movie, they leave behind their clothes, their shoes, their dental fillings, like their contacts, like everything earthly is left on earth, and they are brought up into heaven with Jesus, and the world breaks. It goes into chaos. And so viewing Left Behind for me as a 9-year-old, because it was viewing in our school, we can talk about that and the trauma later. But that led to a couple of moments where I sincerely believed that I had missed the second coming of Jesus Christ, which is a story that I can also talk about that when we have time. But so the authors of Left Behind, so what's interesting is that the authors of Left Behind and its spin-off kids series, which I read most of, the authors of Left Behind take a particular view of the book of Revelation, in which the book can be read as this sort of playbook for the end of the world. So it's this kind of code that we have to break in order to figure out what's going to happen. Because in the series, the characters literally are like reading the book of Revelation, and they're like, this is what's going to happen next. And that's what happens. And so they read this book and other parts of the Bible to figure out what's going to happen as the world spirals further and further out of control until Jesus comes back and he sticks around this time. And so a lot of my exposure was through the films and the spin-off series because I was too young to read the adult books. And I was hooked. And I was so scared of the end of the world. And I thought that I also thought that I understood what this book that we call the Revelation was all about. It was a playbook for the end of the world. And the end of the world was crazy. But here's a slight issue with that, which is that this isn't exactly how the book of Revelation describes itself. So this is the part where we kind of get into understanding it in its context and as it sort of presents itself to us to be understood, so that we can get what those final chapters are meaning for us. But before we go forward, I don't want to just like knock on these authors, because I think that the people who wrote these books do have the right idea, in that they base their hope as Christians on the idea that God is active in history. Like, we're on the same page there. But I think their approach to the book of Revelation neglects the ways in which this book would have had meaning in its original context, in the context that it emerged from. And so, at least for the original audience, Revelation wasn't, and I don't think is, this time capsule to be opened by Christians at the end of the world. So to better understand the whole book and the vision of hope that we see in the final chapters, we have to get a firmer grip on the meaning of the book in its context. And the hope there is that by getting an idea of the messages this book held for its first century audience, we can better understand the message its final chapters hold for us today. So what are we reading when we look at this book? We're going to think of it as a work of literature. So the first verses, I had a house church moment. I was about to ask someone to read this and people would have stared at me very confused. So the first verses are a revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants what must soon take place. Christ made it known by sending it through his angel to his servant John, who bore witness to the word of God and to the witness of Jesus Christ, including all that John saw. So this word revelation in the Greek is this word apocalypsis. It's where we get our word the apocalypse. It's the same word, just English. And so when we hear this word, we might think apocalypse. It equals the end of the world, like this, meteors and like things blowing up. Apocalypse. But that's not really it. Apocalypse more, this word apocalypsis, it more expresses this idea of revealing something that was hidden. And it can also mean like a disclosure of truth, like revealing the truth, which was previously hidden. And one way to think about it, the way that I think is really helpful, is to think of it as an unveiling, sort of pulling back the curtain to see what's going on backstage. So for understanding the Revelation, it's really important to understand that there's a whole genre, like there is a whole bunch of literature that that's coming out around the time that Revelation is written. So like when I'm saying genre, I think like mystery novels or like superhero movies. Like there's a whole type of literature that we call apocalyptic that's coming out at the time. And this genre involves otherworldly beings who reveal things or make things known to people. And it communicates truth through images and symbols like the book of Revelation does. And these symbols aren't exactly meant to be taken literally just like at face value. Doesn't mean that they're not communicating truth, but it means that just taking them at face value is to kind of miss the point a little bit. So the point that I'm making there is that through the symbols and images and crazy stuff that we see throughout the book, and that we're going to see in the final chapters, the author's trying to communicate something about God's perspective on human events. We're apocalypsing God's perspective, sort of pulling back the curtain to show what God sees when he looks at human events, and that should form our imagination and our understanding as well. So again, like other apocalyptic literature, Revelation communicates truth through symbols and images. We'll be coming back to that, so file that away. But Revelation is not only an apocalypse, it's also a prophecy. Oh, we don't have Revelation. So anyway, I'll just read it. Revelation 1:3 says, "Favored is the one who reads the words of this prophecy out loud, and favored are those who listen to it being read, and keep what's written in it, for the time is near." So like the books written by Israel prophets in earlier parts of the Bible, so prophecy is also, it's a key feature of books of the Bible. Revelation is, so just like Israel's prophets, Revelation is speaking words of comfort and challenge to its readers on God's behalf. So we often think, and we talk about this a lot in this church, of prophecy as foretelling, of predicting the future and events that will take place in the future. But more often than not, prophecy is forthtelling. It's communicating what's true about the current reality on God's behalf. So reading Revelation as prophecy, which borrows heavily from Old Testament prophetic books, we can understand that the author's visions of the future are not just about the future. They're about the message the author has for its readers in the now. So in other words, the visions of Revelation are the author's way of warning and comforting the readers so they can respond faithfully to their present day. Okay, so to round out our discussion then of how to read the book with the context in mind, we're going to talk about the third feature of Revelation, which is it's not only apocalypse. So it's not only that it works in a certain way by communicating truth through images and symbols, among other things. It's not only a prophecy that speaks to comfort and challenge its readers. It's also a letter. So Revelation 1:4 says that it says John. It's the greeting of a letter. It says John to the 7 churches that are in Asia. We're talking about the Roman province of Asia, and we'll see it on the map here in a second. Grace and peace to you from the one who is and who was and is coming, and from the 7 spirits that are before God's throne, and from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn from among the dead, the ruler of the kings of the earth. So as a letter, the key takeaway there is as a letter, Revelation is addressed to a particular group of people in a particular context. So John tells us who he's writing to. He's writing to 7 groups of Christians in 7 cities throughout the Roman province of Asia Minor in the 1st century. So you don't have to memorize all that. But the point is, Revelation is a word on target for people in the past, but also one that, as Christians, we believe is a word for us as well. We'll talk about the us part a little bit more in the future, kind of after we think about the aspect of Revelation as a word on target for its people then. So in his overview of the social and historical context of Revelation, Michael Gorman explains that scholars used to read Revelation as being written to Christians who are suffering really heavy persecution in the Roman Empire under the Roman Emperor Domitian and his representatives in Asia Minor in the late 1st century. But this is really interesting. The scholarship on that has changed. More recent scholars have argued that Revelation is written to groups of Christians in the same place in the Roman province of Asia, and what we would call Asia Minor. Or its modern day Turkey. More recent scholars have argued that Revelation is written to groups of Christians who are not dealing with heavy, sustained persecution by the Roman government, but they're dealing with intermittent, localized persecution that's not coming from the government so much as it's coming from friends. It's coming from neighbors. It's coming from local officials on an ongoing basis. So if this is true, like if they're right, which scholars can be wrong, but if this is true, Revelation is to be understood less as a word of comfort to Christians who are intensely persecuted, but we should read Revelation more as a challenge to followers of Jesus who are faced with daily pressures to conform to Roman cultural life, which was inseparable from Roman religion, from its worship from the imperial cult, so the worship or the special honor of the emperor, and the various traditional gods. So because many Christians refused to participate in Roman worship, which included a special kind of worship for the emperor, which I think I have a photo. Yeah, there we go. We have the emperor who would be worshipped by some. Interestingly enough, in some parts of the Roman Empire, they would not worship the empire himself, because they're like, oh no, the empire is not a god. That's crazy. We're gonna worship this guy, who is his genius, his guardian angel, his like spirit, who is divine and guides him along. Which is just interesting. So because many Christians refuse to participate in Roman worship, including a special kind of worship for the emperor, they face social consequences. They came from refusing to participate in aspects of social life that were tied to worship of the Roman gods. Like if you needed to have you have an animal, it needs to be butchered. You're going to take it to the temple. It'll be sacrificed and it's butchered there. The meat would be sold in the markets. If you're going to bank, you're going to take your money to the temple. So you take your money to the temple. People aren't going to get in there and steal it because the temple is sacred. And so much of Roman life was wrapped up in Roman religion. So it's a major problem when early Christians are refusing to participate in Roman religion. So they would be seen by many people as a public menace who not only are antisocial, but they're also atheists. They're impious. Like they would be called atheists because they refuse to honor the gods. And this makes them a public menace. It puts the city in danger if they refuse to honor the gods. So for this reason and others, early Christians are persecuted, and they would have faced intense pressure to compromise their allegiance to Jesus rather than to the Roman gods or to the emperor as the ultimate authority in their lives. So as apocalypse, as prophecy, as letter to its original audience, Revelation's a word on target for 7 different contexts, the 7 churches of Asia Minor, which each need a particular encouragement or challenge to bear witness to the truth and righteousness of God in their local context, as well as the wider context of the Roman province of Asia. So why bother? Like, what's the point? Why bother about all of this? Some people are like, come on, we can wrap up already. Like, this is too much. So why bother with this? Because I think that reading Revelation as apocalypse, as prophecy, as a letter written to real people in real time in a real place means that we can and should understand its message in light of how the original audience would likely have read it. So these first century Christians are under intense pressure to compromise their allegiance to Jesus by worshiping the gods of Rome and its emperor. And this letter is written to comfort them, but also to challenge them not to compromise their allegiance to Jesus by giving themselves over to worshiping the gods of Rome and participating in Roman ways that are tied to this idolatry, this worship of anything that's not God. So then the book of Revelation actually unfolds as this cosmic drama and has all sorts of interesting plot points that I'd love to flesh out in full, but we can't. The basic idea, though, is this, that God has created a good world. He intends for humanity to live in a state of worship of God, communion with others, and harmony with creation. That's God's intention. We might call this the culture of life, or the reign of God, or even the city of God, as Augustine does. We might call this the culture, or sorry, I just read that. However, the enemy of God, the Satan, the enemy, he's opposed to God. He's opposed to God's purposes and continues to pursue God's people. So this is the spiritual enemy of God and the spiritual enemy of humanity. He's opposed to God. He's opposed to God's purposes. And this guy named Michael Gorman, the way that he puts it is interesting. He says that we see in Revelation that the enemy has seduced key human beings to be complicit in creating an anti-culture to God's culture of life, a culture of idolatry, evil, and chaos. We might call this the culture of death, which is given this symbolic name. And its symbolic name is Babylon, which is the city for the Old Testament prophets. For them, Babylon, the city, symbolizes the whole of humanity that's opposed to God and God's good purposes for the creation. So through the people of Israel and through Jesus's life, death, and resurrection, God has enacted a plan to rescue his good world from human evil and corruption by the enemy. And so throughout the book of Revelation, there's this struggle. The enemy is powerful. People of God struggle against him as he seeks to draw humanity's allegiance and worship to himself. However, the enemy ultimately can't win. He is defeated. God judges the enemy's culture of death, which is exemplified in Rome and Rome's idolatry, their greed, their brutality. If you don't know about Rome's brutality to people, it's all around hostility to human flourishing, to human life. God judges the enemy's culture of death, which he sees as kind of exemplified by Rome. And so once the enemy and the enemy's culture of death are crushed once and for all, we come to the final chapters, which are some of the richest images in the pages of the Bible. Images the author uses to communicate truths about God's intentions for humanity and his creation, to draw the grand story of the Bible to its conclusion. Okay, so this is what John sees, the author of Revelation. He says, then I saw, so after all of that we were talking about, after the drama unfolds, after the enemy is defeated, he sees this. He says, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the former heaven and the former earth passed away, and the sea was no more. I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. Okay, so image, symbol. Shifting out of the part of our brain that's thinking literally. But I do actually like this medieval image. Just before we unpack the symbols there, I do like this medieval image of a city just plopping down out of heaven. It's really pretty. So what direction is the city moving? If you caught it, the city's moving down. Which is really significant because we often think of heaven as up. We talk about people going up to heaven. So the city, though, is moving down. And what's happening here is that God's space, heaven, it's moving into our space, which is earth. So the hope for humanity, then, as the author of Revelation sees it, the hope for humanity is not humans flying away to some disembodied heaven where you sit on clouds and talk to people and it's very nice up there. That's not the idea. The future is here. It's in the creation. So God's intention is not to save people's souls so that they can live in some spiritual place forever. God's intention is that, as one of the early Christian creeds puts it, his intention is the resurrection of the body and the life everlasting. And what we're seeing there is that God's intention is to rescue and redeem the created order, not just taking human souls and putting them up in this spiritual box called heaven. We can't separate these things, the resurrection of the body and life everlasting. And so what's more, Revelation's vision of the future extends beyond individual human souls, which is different than what many of us might think of when we think of kind of this popular image of heaven. So God's intention, again, is to redeem the whole created order. There's this famous quote from a guy who says that there's not one square inch of all creation over which God doesn't cry, "This is mine." And God intends it to be so, fully and visibly in the future. So the hope, again, is not humans going up and going somewhere else for all eternity, and their souls flying away. The intention is restoration and redemption of the created order of this that we're in now. So the author uses some key figurative language here to try and articulate what God's intention is for the world. So the first is this image of marriage, which we see throughout the book. So this image emphasizes because marriages are supposed to last, and we know how painful it is when they do not. This image emphasizes the permanence of what God is going to do in rescuing and remaking this world. And it communicates the idea of union between God and God's space and us and our space, the union of heaven and earth. So we'll unpack the implications of God coming into our space as we kind of continue to unpack this passage. And we see some things. I want to stop on this because I want to give us an idea of how some of these images and symbols are working in the book of Revelation. We might scratch our heads when we see this point that the sea was no more. Like, wow, we really hate the beach, don't we? Like, we really hate going to the ocean. This author does. That's not the point. We might remember that if you look back into the Old Testament, for the people of Israel, the sea, they didn't really go like out in the ocean very much. They were not like seafaring people. They didn't like that. So for them, the sea, the ocean, it symbolizes chaos. It symbolizes destruction. And these things are nowhere to be found. That's what this image is communicating. There's only new, or if you prefer, renewed creation, and the God who is coming to dwell in it. Okay, and so Revelation 21:3 says, I heard a loud voice from the throne. So just after that image that we got, I heard a loud voice from the throne say, look, God's dwelling is here with humankind. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. God himself will be with them as their God. So the Christian hope, what we want to catch here, the Christian hope is marked by the perceptible presence of God, which might appeal to us in a world where it seems like God is silent, or it seems like God is absent in the face of suffering and in the face of pain. So one of my favorite moments from one of my favorite films is called Silence. It's directed by Martin Scorsese. It's a moment where this priest who has been suffering, he's been suffering as a missionary to Japan. He's been imprisoned. He's been chased around by the Japanese authorities. And all kinds of stuff. He's been praying and praying and praying and praying and praying for guidance from God. He doesn't hear anything. But in some of the last few, in a really crucial moment, he hears the voice of Jesus for a few moments. And hearing the voice of Jesus changes him. It empowers him for an act of love and of sacrifice that would have been unimaginable had that voice not made itself known to him. And that's just a few sentences spoken by his creator. So whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, just imagine this. Like, imagine if this were true. Imagine the discernible, palpable, like we can feel it, presence of the one who beauty and justice and love and truth and all good things come from. So what would it be like? This is just Revelation fires our imagination. What would it be like to experience this presence on a day-to-day, moment-by-moment basis? Like, how would that change you? Just imagine that. Okay, Revelation 21, 4-5. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. There will be no mourning, no crying or pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. And then the one seated on the throne said, "Look, I'm making all things new." He also said, "Write this down. These words are trustworthy and true." This is going to happen, is what he's saying. So it's not explicit in these chapters, but it's worth taking a moment to notice that if God is going to wipe every tear from our eyes, we have to have eyes in order for that to happen. So the Christian hope is not just new creation. It's the resurrection of the body. It's the life everlasting. The Christian hope is resurrection and new creation, both of which we see in the resurrection of Jesus. So in Surprised by Hope, N.T. Wright argues that Jesus' resurrection, which we in this church often talk about, we believe that this is a well-evidenced real event that happened in real time in history, the resurrection of Jesus. N.T. Wright argues that this is a moment when Jesus is raised is an anticipation of what God is going to do for all of those whose lives are in him. So we see in Jesus what God intends to do for all whose lives are in Christ. So which is why it's important to believe that it actually happened, that God has revealed himself in time, in history, in the person of Jesus, and that the new creation that began in Jesus is the new creation that this author is talking about. The new creation has already begun, and we can anticipate what is going to happen in the future, according to this author. So if the Christian hope is marked by God's presence with his creation, it's also marked by an absence of the things that John is describing here. There will be no mourning, crying, or pain anymore. So as Michael Gorman puts it, this series of negations, it means the removal of everything that prevents human flourishing in community before God, and by removing these things, the presence of everything that permits and promotes that flourishing. So in other words, the hope for the future that John describes is a hope in which all that chokes out life to the full, it's eliminated. It clears the way for wholeness and for right relationships with God and with one another in the creation. Again, just not in this like disembodied heaven that we've escaped to out of this world. God intends to rescue all of it and to remove anything that chokes out life, real life. Yeah. So if that's true, that's compelling. And here we're brought back to the author's purpose. So Revelation 21:7 says, "Those who emerge victorious will inherit these things that were just described. I will be their God, and they will be my sons and daughters." So we're reminded here of the purpose of the vision. The vision isn't given just for filling the reader in on what the future is going to be like. Like, just so you know, here's what's coming. That's not the point. The purpose is deeper. Yes, that in a sense, but also it's given to fuel faithfulness in the present. So knowing the goodness of God's intentions for humanity and for the whole creation, it helps us, whether us is the original readers or us sitting in this room right now, helps us to put our lives into perspective. So if we believe that God's intention is to provide life and wholeness for the creation in the future, then we can trust God in this moment by living in such a way that aligns with what God reveals as good and true and life-giving, just like the original audience is exhorted to live. And along with that, we're empowered by this vision of hope to reject what God reveals to be as life-denying or deceptive or evil. So all of these images, again, it's not just to fill the audience in on what the future is going to be like. It's to empower faithfulness in the present, to drive us and to fuel us now. Okay, so Romans Revelation's first century audience then was to take these symbols, the prophetic words of Revelation, and with this book forming their imagination, they were to resist assimilating to Rome's ways of doing things, accommodating its brutal, idolatrous, and life-destroying ways of being. So Rome was bad news for a lot of people, but it was to their short-term advantage to join in, these early Christians. It would have been very convenient for them to do so, very helpful, even for their relationships with their community. They could be not considered as atheists and dangers to the city. They could be accepted by their neighbors and honored by them. Yet, as the author of Revelation puts it, to do so would be to compromise their allegiance to Jesus and to his culture of life. They were to continue to bear witness to Jesus to the point of suffering and death, which we don't often talk about in the United States right now because we don't see it very much. But that's the thing. Jesus himself died. Like Jesus died bearing witness to the truth of what God revealed. And so that's what this author is hoping for his original audience, at least the way that I read it, is that this vision powers faithfulness in the present for them and for us. Okay, so one final look then at John's vision of the future and how it connects not just to us as individuals, but how it connects to us, humanity as a whole, before we wrap up with some of the practicalities of responding to this. So Revelation 22, 1-5. Then the angel showed me the river of life-giving water, shining like crystal, flowing from the throne of God and the Lamb through the middle of the city's main street. So on each side of the river is the tree of life, which produces 12 crops of fruit, bearing its fruit each month. This is one of my favorite verses in the entire Bible. The tree's leaves are for the healing of the nations. There will be no longer any curse. The throne of God and the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. Night will be no more. They won't need the light of a lamp or the light of the sun, for the Lord God will shine on them always, and they will rule forever and always. Okay, so eagle-eyed readers will notice similarities between the language in these verses and the stories of the Garden of Eden at the beginning of the Bible. They're like bookends. So the tree of life, which humans are not allowed to touch, we're not allowed to be close to. That's why we get booted from the Garden of Eden. The tree of life that we are not allowed to touch is freely available, and it's like thriving. It's fruiting. So it's freely available, and its leaves will heal. Like in this image is, again, it's one of my most favorite images that's in this book. The leaves of the tree are said to be for the healing of the nations. So imagine what this image is trying to get across to us. Imagine the stuff that we can't fix. Like people are trying real hard and we can't fix it. When we think about brutal socioeconomic divides between the rich and the poor in our own country, the racial divides in our own nation that we have not been able to fix. We have not been able to ignore, and we've not been able to just shunt to history. Imagine healing from the trauma and the destruction of war. Imagine a world in which, this sounds a lot like John Lennon, but this is like, John Lennon couldn't touch this. Like this is, John Lennon is so general, like, you know the song Imagine that I'm talking about? John Lennon is so general, and this is so specific, like the book of Revelation is, which is just so fascinating. But yeah, imagine the healing of the trauma and the destruction of war, the needless suffering that comes out of that. Imagine healing the anguish that comes from treachery and betrayal and broken treaties, like our own government's broken treaties with people who lived here before us, whose land we are actually on right now as the result of broken treaties. Just to name a few areas of our US context that need healing. Imagine what it would be like to witness these things restored. That's, if you can imagine that, you can get a glimpse of that. That's what the author is talking about here. So the hope is not, the point there is the hope is not just individual salvation, but the hope is restoration of the human community to right relationship with one another. So it's not just about me and me going to heaven. It's about us being restored and redeemed in communion with one another and in communion with God and in harmony with the world around us. It's cliche because I think we all want it. Like it sounds cliche, like it sounds like something that we would consider like commonplace, like, oh yeah, of course we want to be at peace with the world and everything around us, because I think we're all deeply aching for it, which is why people have used that language so often. So yeah, not just about individual salvation, it's about restoration of the human community, yet at the same time, individual humans matter here. So we're not just thinking about the collective, we're not just thinking about individuals, we're thinking about both. So if we treat this vision and its symbols as communicating what's true about what God intends for the future, imagine what it would be like, whether you're following Jesus or not, just imagine what it would be like to not be at war with our own evil, with our own insecurity, with our own greed, with our own selfishness and our own fear. Imagine just being able to breathe, like imagine being able to simply live without alienation from ourselves and others and the world around us and our creator. That's the idea. And what's really a way that this has been put is that in this reality, people have all they need, and that's expressed in these concrete realities of light and water. Think of how much you need light when you don't have it. Think of how much you need water when you don't have it. Those things are here in abundance. People have everything that they need. In the final lines, they will rule forever and always. This is garden language too. These lines should remind us of what we would call humanity's vocation, our job, the role that's been given to us by God from the beginning. So what God gave to us as a role and as a task, according to the story of the Bible, is that we are to rule or to reign over creation on God's behalf, caring for it, drawing out its potential. And so we're picking this job, this task, back up and living in it to its fullest potential. But what's interesting is that God doesn't return us to square one. So Richard Bauckham, in a quote that I would love to have put up in the slides and did not, says, in the beginning, God had planted a garden for humanity to live in Genesis 2, verse 8. In the end, he will give them a city. So in the New Jerusalem, the blessings of paradise will be restored, but the New Jerusalem is more than a paradise regained. As a city, it fulfills humanity's desire to build out of nature a place of human culture and community. So with evil judged and dealt with, God's plans and purposes for humanity continue in an unending loop moving forward. It's like it made me think of the never-ending game of baseball that we see in the Sandlot. We just pick right back up where we left off. So God's plans and purposes for humanity that we get in the first pages of the Bible, they're not really that derailed by what we do and the rest of the story. It's about God's rescue plan for humanity. The goal is where we start, but we're actually doing it this time, and we are reigning and ruling on God's behalf, trusting in God's authority rather than rebelling against him. And so the story goes on, and this is how it ends, but the ending is the beginning. It's further up and further in, as C.S. Lewis says. And that's how it goes. So to conclude, to wrap us up, so that we have time for discussion, we're not the original audience of Revelation. However, I think that Revelation is a word for us today, and we'll go back to the city being plopped down, because it's just a beautiful image. So I think that Revelation is a word for us today. So we should read Revelation in its first century context to get an idea of what it means for us today, but it has enduring meaning for followers of Jesus here and now in the present, and for those who are not following Jesus. It's an invitation. So for us today, the Revelation and its vision of the Christian hope of resurrection and new creation is not just a comfort, it is also a challenge. So as Richard Bauckham puts it, any society which fits Babylon's cap must wear it. What he's saying there is that the book challenges followers of Jesus to reframe our understanding of things in order to recognize and move away from anything which does not align with God's revealed intentions for his creation, his intentions for wholeness, for flourishing, and life in communion with him and a right relationship with one another. The book is designed to shape our imaginations, to recognize what is of God, his culture of life, flourishing, of wholeness, all that, and to recognize what is not of God and not to accommodate that sort of thing and to assimilate to that sort of thing, like the Christians in the first century would have been tempted to, and like we are today. Revelation presents these stark contrasts between God's rule and reign, God's culture of life, and the way of humanity opposed to God. The culture of death the author sees exemplified in Rome. And the point, again, is to get us to examine our own values, our own commitments, to ultimately choose. Are we going to be loyal to Babylon, as it's symbolically called, the culture of death and its ideology? Or are we going to be loyal to Jesus, who's referred to, he's called the Lamb? We're going to participate in the Lamb's culture of life. So fueled by hope for God's plan for the future, Christians are not to wait around for an escape from the world or try to bring about God's renewed creation by our own efforts. If we were to try to do that, that would indicate that we really underestimate the power of evil in our world, how strong it is and how entrenched evil is in our world, and how deeply we need God ultimately to be the one who heals it. However, what we can do is we can live lives characterized by witness, which means that we live lives that are shaped now in a way that reflects the truth of what's coming in the future. So, in other words, we should live now like the future actually is true, because for God, it already is. If God exists outside of time, this future is already realized with God. We are just waiting on it to appear. And so we should live like it's true, like it's going to happen, in anticipation of that. So faithful living for Christians is the final application point, and then we're gonna have time for discussion. So faithful living for Christians, in part, looks like living in the present, as if what's revealed about the future is actually true. And so N.T. Wright, who's, again, he's got a great book on this topic, he suggests that if God's intending to reveal or to redeem all of creation, space and time, matter, and us, then our lives should celebrate that redemption, that healing and transformation in the present, and anticipate God's final intention by doing such things as, if we understand that there is going to be nothing but justice, nothing but right relationships between humans in the future, then we should try to cultivate that now in our individual relationships and wider as we're able. If God values the created world as he's made it, the beauty that he's built into it and that he intends to restore and redeem, then we also should value beauty. We should create and we should be active in the created world. We should create beautiful works of art. We should create beautiful family systems. We should create beautiful relationships with our clients and the people that we work with. We should create beautiful scholarship. Whatever we're doing, we should be engaged in this present world because God is caring about it now, but also in the future. God intends for all of it to be restored and redeemed. And so the quote that I'll leave us off with from N.T. Wright is he talks about how maybe most significantly for us, this vision of the future, it impacts how we talk about the good news of Jesus. And this is what N.T. Wright has to say about that. He says, the power of the gospel lies, let's see, do I have this? I don't have this up. Okay. So he says that the power of the gospel lies not in the offer of a new spirituality or a religious experience, not in the threat of hellfire, and certainly not the threat of being left behind, which I was so scared of as I was growing up, which can be removed if only the hearer checks this box, says this prayer, raises a hand, or whatever. But the power of the gospel lies in the powerful announcement that God is God, that Jesus is Lord, that the powers of evil have been defeated, and that God's new world has begun. He goes on to say that the gospel, the good news that God's kingdom has broken into our reality in Jesus the King, it means that all people everywhere are invited to come in, gladly invited to come in, to discover forgiveness for the past, an astonishing destiny in God's future, and a vocation, a role, and a task in the present. So that, I believe, is a good place to leave off with the invitation to future hope and present faithfulness that these chapters offer to us. So whether we're following Jesus or not, we are invited to find life and hope in the story of what God is doing and will do in the world. And we're invited to join in. So that's what I got. For folks who want to talk about it and unpack this, we have a few minutes. Questions or comments? Yeah.
I think a lot of what you covered here